Hi, I'm Rigger. This is You Alright, and it is time for episode 4 of Volume 9 of RWBY. And this was a pretty interesting episode, so we're going to dive straight into it. Before we get started, just remember this is a thoughts video, not a reaction. You do need to have seen the episode yourself to understand what I'm saying. I'll use some images from the show to illustrate what I'm talking about, but just so you're all aware. Anyway, getting straight into it. This was an episode that had a fair bit of hype around it. Not really based on anything in particular, just a few stirrings online and a few things on Twitter of some of the people involved in RWBY saying that episode 4 was one to look out for. So people were really hyped about this one. I saw a lot of speculation on what it could be. Of course, whenever anything happens this volume, whenever there's any hype, the first thing everyone jumps to is Bumblebee Kiss, or people were thinking, well, Neo showed up last time, so maybe Jean shows up this time, or we get more from Neo. But instead we went a bit of a different direction and got to something I was waiting for, which was our big smoky revelation. Or I guess revelation isn't the right word in every sense, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Starting off though, we are back with the Curious Cat and RWBY giving chase. And I have to say, the Curious Cat being the Curious Cat, there is so much you could read into all the dialogue. You could probably make tons of theories about every line that he says, because the way that they're written is meant to sound suggestive. It's meant to sound like they could have double or triple meanings, even when they don't. And, I mean, it's pretty effective, I will say. Like, it's written well to be similar to Cheshire and those kind of characters where you really get the feeling they know more than you and they're just not saying it, or they are saying it and you have to figure it out. So, I want to first praise that it does have that feeling getting through. It also meant that we got the question of what his name is, and all we got was a cat most curious, so there you go. I was under the impression they were actually going to call him Cheshire. I don't know where I picked that up, but whatever. Anyway, so we do get an important line that we have heard before, I mean in promo and stuff, which is, you don't go to the tree, it comes to you unless you're me. Again, so the cat is the key to most of this. We do need his help, but as he illustrates, he has no desire to go back to the tree. Why would he ever want to go back? And a sight seen is not worth seeing, as he said. So, again, we get the idea there's some resistance there, and you can never tell if it's just the cat being the cat or if there's a poor experience. But this does move on to Alex, and this really piques the cat's interest. You know, how do you know her? Tell me about it. And, I mean, you get a funny line where he can smell the mouse, and Blake has to step in and say, from one cat to another, can you give us a minute? And the cat says, oh, it's spoken for. So, yes, Blake has dibs on eating little. But, either way, you do get little things that I'm not sure whether we should be questioning or not, which is, again, one of the strengths here. Like, for instance, you have Cheshire chasing the butterfly, and it leads into a patch of butterflies, and we don't really see the source of it or what happened, but suddenly tons of butterflies, all different colors, stream up with like a magical accompanying sound. Did something happen we didn't see? Because everything was purposely hidden in the grass. So, do we read into it or not? It's hard to tell. And we start getting back into the question of who are you back to them? What is a huntress? What are these sort of things? And it will come up again. And they do things like placating the cat, realizing they need to entice the cat, play on his nature, which is something I talked about last episode, where you can really learn to manipulate the people in Ever After if you just understand what their name is, and some of them are clear and some of them aren't. Well, I mean, they're all sort of clear, it does tell you about them, but how to manipulate them isn't always clear. Like, how to manipulate the Jinxie Peddler isn't necessarily completely obvious, but it just tells you what he is and how he works, and then you have to work from there. But the Curious Cat, much more easy to manipulate, just play into his curiosity, so they get the cat talking. And they entice him in with things he hasn't seen before. Have you ever seen a scroll? And, you know, we of course get the cat taking selfies, things like that. And if it seems like I'm sort of speedrunning the start of this episode, I am, because we have a lot to talk about at the end. But we need to sort of pump the brakes here and talk about this next section, because I really think people's enjoyment of this section, and maybe even of this volume, could get a big critical hit here, where you have to be in a certain mindset or a big fan to enjoy this section, and if you aren't one of those things, if you're someone who's very negative or wants to be negative about the show, I feel like you have a lot of ammunition here with how they decided to take this scene. And I'm not saying I'm not a fan of it, but it's something that I think is going to pop up in a lot of critique videos, which is the next scene where the cat runs down the show. So we skip forward and basically Ruby and the girls have been telling the cat everything. They have no reason not to. They've apparently been telling the cat about their entire adventure and what they've seen and done, from all the things that should be secrets and everything else. And that's fair enough, but what the cat does is, well, very Cheshire Cat, where it does something I mentioned earlier in the story, even before we met him, which is critique the story. We had earlier, I think it was episode 2, we had them speaking very meta about the plot. The girls were talking about they should have done things differently or not, and is it right and wrong, and are morals simple, things like that. And it was very much a critique of the show, but hidden behind a layer. This is not hidden behind a layer. This is the cat just commenting on the show and talking directly to the audience, basically. And sometimes even looking down the barrel of the camera. So looking to the audience and just outright saying things. Some of them are funny, some of them you could critique, some of them seem like statements from the people creating the show. So let's go down that list. The old man and the boy share a body, well, that has uncomfortable implications. Okay, that was something that was talked about when it happened, and doesn't mean that those implications have gone away, and it could be a reason to bring it up again because we might be dealing with more of that once we get back to Remnant, because that might have progressed even further, and what that ends up being, because there's lots of ideas about what that's going to be, but no one knows if they're right or not. Anyway, point is that already we're bringing up a criticism people had, and the next part is tied into that. Who thought that was a good way to reincarnate? And the implications of that are twofold. One, it's a critique of the gods, and a lot of people have had critiques of the gods and their approach, and usually that critique is, oh, they're crappy gods and we don't like them. But people take that further as a critique of the writing, that they're poorly written and they're not very good gods, and whoever wrote them isn't thinking in a very godly way. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. You could just have crap gods. There's no reason they can't be that way. But this also could be seen as the writers acknowledging a shot at themselves. Who thought that was a good way to reincarnate? As in, maybe if we did it again, we wouldn't do it this way? Who knows? If what I'm saying makes sense, it's not just within the story who thought, it's when creating the story who thought this was a good idea, and maybe they're acknowledging some things they wouldn't change, but also acknowledging some things that people have talked about because they do it again. You know, who thought it was a good way to reincarnate? Was it the same people who thought putting a city in the sky was smart? Again, you can critique that, right? Is it that, the Atlesians and Ironwood and such, they were pompous and greedy and overconfident and wanted a big display of power and therefore did something unnecessary by putting the city in the sky, which didn't seem to have a whole lot of benefits, except for being off the ground, which, less grim and so forth, for sure. But in general, did seem like an unnecessary move, or was it, hey, why did we put this in the show? And, that's a reference to a lot of other animes and stuff, but, oh, was it a good idea to put this in the sky? That one, I think there you can cut a little more slack on the creators, because they are referencing other things that did that, which has been all throughout RWBY, and there are reasons you can justify for doing it, but, again, it's riding that line. And the reason that's important is because it links the two, because you could say, oh, the Atlas one wasn't about the writers, but they linked the two together. Who thought that was a good way to reincarnate? Was it the same people who thought putting a city in the sky? Which, it wasn't the same people because the gods didn't have that idea, but it was the same people because the same people were writing the thing. Anyway, and then they take a direct shot at, well, a lot of people. Did that CL girl come back in another way? Of course, CL Soleil, that people have talked about forever, wanting to see forever. Of course, other RWBY tubers talk about her. And, she didn't come back in Atlas, where a lot of people thought she would. And then there's a direct follow-up to that. Did CL come back in a notable way? There's so many characters to keep track of. And this is something that definitely ties into actual criticism of RWBY, and perhaps an actual excuse from creators, which... This is one of those ones that I think really people that want to attack the show are going to hold on to, because the answers are a little complicated. Like, did that CL girl come back in a noble way? No, and she didn't have to. That's not a requirement. But I think most fans can say it would have been nice to see her. I mean, you're going to her hometown. She's an established character. People would like to see them. It's just like when we got Neon and Flint. Same thing. And it's not like... It isn't an understandable thing when you make a long-running show that has a theme based around lots of characters, because, there's all these teams, so you see background characters and things, and you need lots of designs that you forget about some of them. That can definitely happen. And, it's definitely a thing where RWBY has come under fire for having too many characters. You don't need all these characters, and sometimes it's come as a bit of a detriment where something would happen, say at the school, and it seems like it's not being taken care of very well, when in theory there should be hundreds of huntsmen in training there. Even if not that many, you have all these teams that you're sort of not seeing that are in the background, and they don't seem to ever show up. Now, that's more understandable, especially when their budget was lower and, their production was lower. But here, saying at this point, there's so many characters to keep track of, that is true, and I can definitely understand them forgetting some, but then they keep adding more, and that's where the criticism comes in, that it's a mistake that's okay to make, but it keeps getting made, and addressing it like this is cheeky and having fun and winking at the audience, and they're winking at RWBY tubers and theorists and people who run wikis and all those kind of things, people who run blogs, and saying, yeah, like, we acknowledge that, that girl didn't come back, that character you all wanted to see, but we hear you, we sort of are acknowledging the fact, and basically it almost feels like they're saying we forgot about her, or we had so many characters to keep track of, it just didn't turn up. And I actually think that one would be more likely that sometime they were going to have her in there and they just didn't find a spot, so they left it out, which I feel like that's been said somewhere. But either way, but it does make it sound like they legitimately forgot, which I find hard to believe, considering that people like RWBY tubers and stuff, not saying that especially someone like my size or anything, but some of the bigger ones especially that definitely have been acknowledged, they talk about that character, people were talking about it, you had gaps between volumes where people were theorizing about it, talking about it, that expectation was there, so if you did just forget, it means you weren't paying attention to your community, because they didn't forget. And, it's not some minor little thing. I mean, it is a minor little character, but it's a character that, like, we're going to this character's home, and if there's any time for them to show up, it should be there. And then, I'm sure you could find at least a handful of videos with decent amount of views for RWBY stuff that talks about them. I know Arnold has talked about it, especially. So, I don't know. I don't know if this was the smartest idea. And I know this isn't a critique of the episode, and we have a lot more to talk about, but this was a prevalent thing that happened, and I feel like you equally have acknowledged your audience and had fun with them, and I'm fine with that, I'm not mad at this. But I think also people that want to rag on this show are going to take some of those questions and throw them out there as the writers admitting they're incompetent or giving excuses or something like that. So I definitely acknowledge that it makes sense for the Cheshire Cat-like character, who is a character who is in the story, seems above the story, is almost a godlike figure in the Alice in Wonderland stories, where he seems to almost know he's in a story or know the story that's going on. He comments on things, as if he's all-knowing, or basically, and he can be everywhere at once, and he's weird, and he can almost break the fourth wall. And that's what this character is doing. I applaud that. I just think this might not go so well in the whole critiquing thing. But we'll move on, because I don't want to spend the whole episode on this. Because then the Curious Cat actually does something else that's quite interesting, which is something else that the Cheshire Cat does too, which is sometimes seem kind of menacing. And it's one of those ones that, again, is purposely hard to read. It's when they're talking at the end of their conversation about Alex, and Blake says, well, Alex learned her lesson by the end, didn't she? Talking about when she was lying and things like that. And the cat replies, oh, I'd certainly say so. And the camera sort of lingers on him for a second, almost like in a menacing way, like, oh, she learned her lesson, all right. So maybe there's things that are left unsaid. Although, it really wouldn't imply that she's dead or anything, because the cat still accepts that she went home and wrote a book, or hasn't questioned that. And would be in his nature to question that if he didn't think that was the case. So, but maybe something else happened there that isn't in the book, or is misinterpreted. But either way, they go on to talk about the acres, the way they work, and the cat elaborates that each acre is made specifically for its inhabitants and their roles. And question, isn't it like that on Remnant? And no. And which is very odd to him. So that is definitely what it looked like, and it definitely feeds into that idea of the Ever After is putting people in roles and puts everyone in their role and creates a land for them in their role. And if you want to hear me talk more about that, I have a Neapolitan theory that I put out last week that I think you'd all like to see, and that'll be linked at the end. So if you haven't seen that, you might want to check it out because it could become quite important. And then the Curious Cat is an extra dick because he, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, starts dumping all the weight of the situation they're in on Ruby's shoulders by asking the string of questions. How many relics is it that Salem needs to win again? That immortal lady? How are you even gonna beat her? And of course, this starts crushing Ruby on the spot until the cat goes missing again. Which seems like it's gonna be a plot device where whenever, they need the cat to get around, but they'll constantly get sidetracked as the cat will run off and do something like a cat. From there, though, they head over following a deep sound, and they find the caterpillar, who is a herbalist, who is hiding in the leaves, who this seems to be his realm. And of course, he has a big glowing toadstool. And what I predicted would happen from the start happened. So, yay for me for being able to pay attention to what happens in Alice in Wonderland. But yes, he will take them on their smoke journey. Who would have thought, right? But then, definitely I was wrong. The home we see in the trailer that I thought might have been Alex's with someone trying to understand the surroundings is not. It's actually the herbalist place inside the toadstool. He has a whole bunch of science equipment because he is, again, a herbalist like a doctor. And the cat actually calls him Herb, which is a good name, so I always call him Herb. Anyway, so they speak to Herb, and Herb, of course, questions who they are, or what they are. What are you? And they have a very interesting conversation about how they're getting sick of that question, and I imagine we're going to hear it even more, but that becomes the crux of what's happening, is despite the fact that he gives off a slightly menacing aura, and it almost feels like the girls have come across a villain, he really isn't that, and it's sort of the same in the original story, where the caterpillar is a bit, you can't tell if you can trust him or not, but he says things that definitely are important and you need to pay attention to. So they go inside the toadstool, and he says he begins helping them. He doesn't even say he wants to help them, it's not a bargain, and as we talked about before, there is no money in the ever after, so it doesn't seem like he's asking for anything yet, at least. And he goes about helping them by packing up some leaves. And he asks them again what they are. And they start getting frustrated at the question, and they respond with huntress. And he questions, well, what's a huntress? They say, oh, this and that, and they can't really get an answer out until, I believe it's Blake, blurts out that a huntress is a hero who protects people. And then he asks back, well, are you a good huntress? And this makes everyone freeze, especially Ruby, because of course she's thinking about all the failures they just had. So maybe not. And they get frustrated with him, can you stop asking these questions? Can you help us? And this is where he shows some real emotion and says very strongly that he's trying. You are stopping him helping you. And it will become clear that that's his role. He says as much. His role is the herbalist. He's a medicine man. He's meant to help people. He helps them become who they're meant to be. But if you want to become who you're meant to be, you need to have a better understanding of who you are now. And as soon as he said something like that, I knew where we were going with this, the scene that people have been talking about since we saw it in the trailer. And of course, you have the hookah smoking caterpillar and they're about to go to a place full of smoke. What did you think was going to happen? But either way, he gets frustrated and he takes them to the back room and says, hey, just, hang out here for a second, and then closes the door on them. And they are about, ready to fight, although they're all still tiny. One of the things they were going to get was to get a growth parfait? Something like that. I can't remember the name they said, a fun name. But something to grow, some food to make them grow. But either way, he catches them with hookah smoke. He smokes and then fills the room with it, and they all start horribly choking on it. Oh no, are they going to die? Of course not. They go on their little vision quest. Oh, and notably, one thing that was actually interesting is before he said that, he said an interesting line when he said that they didn't understand themselves very well. He said, this is how a king becomes a prince, which of course makes you think of the Red King and now the Red Prince, which says to me, and maybe it's just a mini theory that doesn't really matter, that the king is gone, but this isn't his son, so to speak, that this, the son and the king did not exist at the same time. That the king was perhaps destroyed or reduced, and the prince is either what's left or was rebuilt, a smaller version who is like a younger, more emotional, more erratic version of himself. It's almost like if you take the adult and broke them down into smaller bits, and you only had a little bit left over and put them back together, that would equal almost a younger part of themselves that hasn't grown up yet. I think that might be how the prince was made. If it wasn't for Alex, the king would still be here. Maybe it's that he didn't just die, but he was destroyed and then put together again like the dolls were, like the toys can be, like it seems like the guards can be, and instead is made the prince. So that could be it. I think that's kind of interesting. He didn't understand himself, so he isn't totally himself. That's what happened there. That's why the prince isn't what he should be. Although he's trying, he can't sort of do it. And anyway, he's saying that would happen to them, and then he fills the room with smoke and they go on their vision quests, and it's very much a throwback to when Jin took them into the individual blue, smoky realms to show them the Salem and Oz story. And we even get a callback to that where Yang calls out to Blake and then RWBY, and all of them get visited by their younger selves. And it's all very... how do I put this? It's very basic, and I don't mean that as like a criticism necessarily, because it's based on a children's tale, but they all their old versions just offer them the really obvious stuff. They appear, and so for Yang, she says, you can go back to who you were before. You can be whole, basically. Again, mentioning her arm, but not just her arm, but her losses and things like that. But of course, Yang fires up at this and says, no, my losses made me who I am, and they've made me, what I meant to be, and I'm a huntress, that's the line, I'm a huntress. And same thing for Blake. Young Blake appears and said, you can be a person, or be a cat, which is a weird way to address it, but what they're getting at is, you don't have to be this bridge between human and faunus. And I think what they mean is, not you can be a human or be a cat. It's, you can live like a faunus and live with your people, and just disappear and not try and make a difference and make a change. Or you could hide your ears and live amongst people and just never reference that you're a faunus and get away with it. You don't have to be this stand-up representation of the, crossing of culture and being a bridge for positive change and do all these really hard things. You could live a simple life. And of course, Blake says the same thing, this is what I want, my culture is a part of me, and I want to be here, and I want to help people, and, this is what I'm meant to be. I'm a huntress, right? Same conclusion. I'm a huntress. So they've declared they're a huntress. And Weiss as well. The Schnee name is a huge weight on your shoulders. Why are you carrying it? And, you can put all this behind you. And Weiss does a big, long speech. And I don't want to be too critical, because they all delivered these speeches pretty well. I think Weiss was the weakest, but then again, she had the longest to do, so it's a bit harder to keep up the intensity when you have a longer speech with more parts. But either way, she says what you'd think. I am the granddaughter of a hero, but the daughter of a villain. And I own all of that, and I will not be defined by my name, and I am Weiss-Schnee, and I'm a huntress, right? But basically, that's what she says. And again, same thing. And the reason I say it's simple is because the episode ends with this, they all except for RWBY, because RWBY's got the main character thing, we'll get to her in a second. But all the others really accept their roles and get to their big punchy, I am a huntress line very quickly. It's all done, and none of them are even tempted. It doesn't even seem to cross their minds, except for maybe a second or two while the other one is talking. Yang considers her arm and is thinking, but it never actually is a challenge. None of them are really confronted by this idea. They all dismiss it pretty quickly. Except for RWBY, right? And RWBY gets the longest scene, but she's the one who's really meant to be struggling with this. And of course, the things that the Cheshire Cat just brought up about how impossible all this is come to the forefront as young RWBY faces down with RWBY. It says references to things that are actually slightly off, but, close enough. Are you a huntress like the ones you read in the books? Well, it actually was hero at the time. But either way, they repeat Blake's line, life isn't a fairy tale. So we have callbacks to way back at the beginning of Volume 1, and they were almost exact, so good job. And, all those things, this isn't fair. It all comes down to you. They're asking you, basically, to fight forever, right? You have to fight and fight and fight, and your mom was great, Summer was the best, and even she failed, well, Salem took her from you. So we have even more reference to Summer, which still has me holding out for stuff I've said earlier. But either way, they're bringing her up again and treating her like she's dead still, which is fair. And she probably is or close to. But either way, as far as RWBY knows, yes, your mom was brilliant and failed. You could never hope to be a mom, and she failed. And Salem is unbeatable, and it's all on your shoulders. And, we haven't been winning so far, we just failed a bunch. And it's not fair for you to have to fight forever, is it? And you don't even have to be Ruby Rose anymore if you don't want to be, You can just be whoever you want to be. And obviously, RWBY is the most tempted by this. Like, she doesn't have an answer. She doesn't come out with a fiery speech like the other three did. She is pretty defeated by everything in front of her, though she doesn't say no, and she doesn't say yes. She is definitely stuck with all this weight on her shoulders, and we're still not getting the answer to that, which is probably going to be an end of the volume thing, right? She's going to get to a revelation near the end, and it might be that she wants to redefine herself as something slightly different, but will still do good. I don't know if it will be completely undone, and she'll just be like, no, I'm a huntress. But she might come up with a new answer. And I think it's also the idea of RWBY is our main character, but RWBY, the series, hasn't really needed a main character. Like, RWBY was our eyes to start, but it's always been about all of them, that like all the girls have been on the journey and they've had their highlights at different points and they've had focus at different points. So RWBY is our by default main character, but here she's definitely getting the main character thing and the main character treatment. And yeah, so she doesn't have her direct answer, and of course she's the leader as well, so everyone's looking to her, all these things. And before RWBY can be pressed for an answer or give whatever answer is on her mind, the Cheshire Cat dives in, breaks the illusion, clears everything up. And obviously we've given a little out for RWBY because we haven't heard her answer yet, and surely we'll dive into it more. But then we do get one little thing that people have talked about and I haven't read into as much, but it's definitely here. The Curious Cat tells Herb that he's, losing it a bit. And what he says is, here, have some of my heart. And the little magical bits of Curious Cat go over the chest of Herb and does make him feel better. He sort of, comes to his senses a little bit. And he wasn't completely out of it, he was just a little overwhelmed. And again, we have the switch of someone who you thought was maybe menacing and maybe doing harm to them, pulled out of it, and he says immediately, like, oh, I'm just trying to help. It's what I do. Sometimes I work a little too hard. All basically saying he was just pushing them a little too hard. He was pushing the issue, but he wasn't a bad guy, and he didn't mean them harm, and none of them are hurt, and none of them could be hurt. It was just an illusion. It was just a vision quest for them, is what he was basically implying. Like, sorry, I went a bit too far, but I really wanted to help you guys. It's my role, that's what he does. But the Curious Cat actively affecting people and affecting their emotions, especially in a positive way, is something to look out for, because it could be something that could help, but it could be something that could hinder, because if he can afflict your emotion, if he can affect how you feel, all I'm saying is it's a very, very useful tool if you were a villain or you wanted to manipulate someone. You feel bad about me? No, you don't. You feel good about me? Better to get my way. But it might not be used like that. But it's something to look out for, especially that he has, again, even more power. Cheshire is so powerful. Like, we gotta acknowledge, he seemingly can teleport anywhere at any time. He also can split his body into parts, which also implies he pretty much can't be hurt, especially if he can sever body parts and put them back together. He also seems to know everything and has been everywhere, and he can now affect people's emotions as well, which people were saying they think he did to the prince when he was trying to persuade him, which it seems like he might have. So we have basically, if the cat is revealed to be the essential god or guardian of Ever After, I'm pretty much leaning towards that. I think he is. Like, he's that powerful. So, his role is to, guide you through this story, but not everyone may make it, sort of thing. He's just the guide that takes you through the journey you have to go through, but you have to make it. So I think that might be the case, but that's, again, kind of the Cheshire Cat's role. And the last thing I wanted to mention was, I do think it's interesting that we have our first villainous character who is not a villain, and in the Ever After, and I think this is going to be a reoccurring theme, because I think it even applies to the prince. Like, the prince is misguided, and a bit sadistic, but as is always said, they play their role. They are who they are. They are who they have to be. And the reason he got violent and upset was because his role was being challenged. He couldn't do it. Unlike a bit in the actual story where the Red Queen is just evil. I don't think the prince is just evil. Although, definitely he's much worse than, say, Herb is. Herb seems like a really good guy who means well, but he's like a gruff old man. He's trying to help you out, but he's going to give it to you straight and he's not going to let you mess around. And I think that might come up more, where you get these characters who are stern, who are set in their ways, who aren't going to change for you, but are probably right and are going to push you in the right direction. And again, you could even say that the prince did that. He made them question themselves and get developments and move through the story, which again is part of his role. So again, I think it's a pretty good crafting of what it would be like to be in a fairy tale. To be in this narrative, to be in a world where the world is pushing the narrative. And that can be sometimes a harsh reality to face. And obviously, that really applies to RWBY, who is facing it harder than anyone else right now. I think for my initial thoughts for the episode, that'll do it. Definitely a really interesting one. I'm glad we got this bit out of the way because we're 4 episodes in, so we're almost halfway and we really need RWBY to be pondering these questions because I feel like that's going to be something towards the end of the volume, so we need her to really start stewing on these questions for a few episodes. Interesting we haven't got Jean yet. I expect him probably next episode. Any later than that, I'm starting to worry he'd be way too rushed because I feel like there's story there. We definitely have more people to meet. We might get them out from being small soon. And it also means that, just a thought, when we see in the trailer they go to the big spiral-y thing, I thought that the caterpillar might be on top of that, and he isn't. He is on top of this, inside this toadstool, which is very interesting. Oh, also, before we leave, I wanted to mention that, again, just because everyone was going a bit wilder about it, that is not a relic. We're pretty sure now that there's no extra relic hiding out in the caterpillar's room. I don't think there's any relics here. It was glowing blue because he lives in a place with glowing blue mushrooms and plants everywhere, so it's probably got something glowy inside it. So we can put that one to bed. But anyway, I really enjoyed the episode. I'm really enjoying this volume so far. I do think that the bit where the cat is being very meta about the show and commenting on the show is gonna be divisive, so let me know your thoughts on that and where you stand. And until next time, my name is Rigger. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I did alright.